Now, the former United States Vice President Dick Cheney once said the September 11 attacks on the World Trade Center had changed everything.
This week, the US Studies Centre in Sydney is hosting a summit to discuss just what some of those changes have been as the 10-year anniversary of the attacks approaches. One of the speakers is Professor Stephen Krasner from Stanford University. He's the former Director of Policy Planning at the US Department of State, and he joins us now from Sydney. Stephen Krasner, really good to talk to you. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
It's a fairly true assertion, isn't it, that in a sense 9/11 changed everything. But has almost everything changed back in time?
Not really, in the sense that I think that what 9/11 demonstrated was something that, certainly for Americans, but in a sense at a global level as well, was a possibility that transnational terrorist organizations could fundamentally threaten modern, liberal, industrialized democracies. And even though 10 years later it's in some ways surprising, even shocking, that there hasn't been a literal repeat of 9/11 with thousands of people killed, although with Bali and other bombings there have been a number of substantial number of deaths, that threat is not going away. So it's not the case that everything went back to the way things were on September 10th.
No, and I don't mean to assert that everything went back, but in a sense, our attitude or our sense of fear, perhaps in the West and perhaps mistakenly, seems to have shifted back. I mean, now you will hear conversations which were unthinkable, say, back in the year or two after 9/11, about why do we have to go through all this security when we fly on an airline? Why can't I take my tube of toothpaste with me? Why do I have to take my shoes off?
Yeah.
Conversations you would never have thought of before.
No, that's very correct. And I think the challenge, in some ways, the challenge for people that are making public policy is that we're dealing with a situation where we have a small chance of something really bad happening. And that it hasn't happened for an extended period of time makes it hard to bring home to people how vivid the threat still remains. So what you're saying is absolutely correct.
So you still see that threat as clear, present, vivid?
Imagine that there were a series of terrorist attacks that killed hundreds of people or even thousands of people, or even imagine a nuclear or biological attack, either one of which is highly unlikely but not unimaginable. It would change the way in which we live. And that's something that we have to continue to confront, in terms of what we're doing with intelligence, effective policing, and other kinds of foreign policy.
We still see this issue, though, don't we? It strikes me sometimes as a terribly unsophisticated and limited way. You were saying that, OK, since 9/11 there hasn't been a repeat of, say, the disaster in Lower Manhattan that we saw on that day with thousands killed. And yet for a place like Pakistan, it has pretty much been a kind of 9/11 over and over and again. That country is paying a huge price for the tensions within the country, for the aspirations of terrorist groups there who are terrorising their own, as well as outside of that state. And yet we don't really take much account of that.
Well, no, I wouldn't say, at least sitting in the United States, I think the United States is extremely worried and very concerned about developments in Pakistan.
But that's a personal worry as a threat against them. Actually looking at that situation, that terrorist tension playing out within that country and the people of Pakistan themselves paying that price, we don't seem to really take account of that.
I think I don't want to say that, if looking at this from an American perspective, that people have the same kind of emotional reaction to terrorist strikes in Pakistan that they obviously had to terrorist strikes in New York. But American policymakers are really worried about Pakistan. The problem is not a lack of anxiety about Pakistan and how to stabilize Pakistan. And the challenge for the United States is what policy can we actually pursue that would be effective.
And that's been the most confusing thing, isn't it, as we've just seen recently with the Americans having to go in and get Osama bin Laden on their own and simply not trusting their own partner. It's all very well to have intelligence on the ground, although question marks have been raised about how good that is. But what kind of working relationship can you have with Pakistan? Do you have a theory on that?
I would say I wish I did. I think the problem is, if you look at the Pakistani political structure and the Pakistani elite, They're torn in many different directions. They're extremely anxious about India. They're worried about the United States leaving. There are some people that are very supportive of radical Islamic ideologies and others that are opposed. The country has a basically weak governing structure. So, I mean, what I think the United States has done, the Obama administration, and to some extent the Bush administration before it, is to try and strike specific deals with the Pakistanis about doing specific things, something that the Obama administration has now been very insistent about. But in terms of an overall strategy about how to stabilize Pakistan, that has eluded the United States and everybody else as well.
Almost 10 years after 9/11, how would you describe American power now as it's projected to the world?
So, I mean, there is this general perception that American power has declined. First of all, I think that's much exaggerated. But I think what one has to do in stepping back is to recognize that the anxiety about the decline in American power is not so much a function, I think, of American policies or even American failed policies, which is the way in which most people would perceive Iraq, but as a result of the growth of China. So if you could take China out of the equation and you say compare the United States with other major industrialized areas in the world, Europe hardly doing very well. Japan, I mean, has basically been in the doldrums for 20 years. So the anxiety about the decline in American power is, I think, more a reflection of the rise of Chinese power than it is anything that has to do even with the fact that the United States has certainly stumbled over the last decade in some ways.
Shifting our geopolitical focus for just a moment away from China and towards the Middle East and watching what's going on there with the so-called Arab Spring. As far as I've been able to analyse and think about this, I can't see any parallel with or connection to a post-9/11 world, what's going on in these countries. It seems to be very much in and of itself, simply young people bridling against old men and their power. Is there any connection that you would draw?
No, I think your assessment there is absolutely correct. So you've had these repressive regimes, limited opportunities, especially for people that were young and relatively well educated, extreme levels of frustration. No, I don't think this is a reflection of 9/11 or Iraq or other American policies or even the situation, the Palestinian-Israeli situation. I think it's generated by the conditions within these countries.
Al-Qaeda has had no role in this, which has also been very pleasing for not only those countries themselves but the international community to see as well. But can you see in these power vacuums some sort of antisocial or terrorist intent creeping in?
Let me say, I don't know. First of all, it varies from country to country.
Yep.
So the answer for Yemen would be clearly yes, and the answer for Tunisia would be probably no. The answer for Libya would be maybe. I think the thing to recognize about these movements is that the outcome is extremely uncertain. The people that are in Tahrir Square in Cairo, are expressing very liberal, modern democratic sentiments that we in Australia or the United States understand completely. They're not representative of the country as a whole, and how these political movements will evolve and where these countries will be in 2 years or 10 years is very uncertain right now.
Now, just in the last little while, Secretary Gates has been asked whether bin Laden's death is a game changer, the phrase used. His answer, not yet. What's your view?
No, I think the answer is not yet. And I think it's not that Al-Qaeda hasn't, on the one hand, Al-Qaeda's been weakened by bin Laden's death and other developments. On the other hand, it's morphed into these kind of sometimes individual operations around the world. I think the deeper problem is that we're confronted with this situation in which relatively weak actors could do extremely bad things, that they could get things more than sticks of dynamite to throw into theaters, which is what terrorists did at the end of the 19th century. And that threat is never going away. And it's not just a threat that has to do with Islamic radicalism. It could come from any disgruntled, disaffected movements or even individuals in the industrialized world. And in that sense, that's a game changer. That's a game changer for the world. That's never existed at any time historically in the past.
And that's the classic post-9/11 scenario. Stephen Krasner, really good to talk to you this morning. Enjoy your time in Australia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your time.